During the first half of the 20th century, Russia experienced one crisis after another. World War I, the Russian Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II forced the country to mobilize millions of soldiers to fight on the front lines. Each one of them was a mouth to be fed, for, as all governments know, when troops starve they abandon military duties and run from the army. On the other hand, undernourished soldiers are more likely to be defeated, since they do not have enough energy to perform effectively. In World War II, the Soviet Union had to organize the supply of its armed forces so that they did not suffer from lack of food. This was a gigantic effort, because the economic situation was far from adequate to participate in a war of these dimensions. During the fight, the Russian soldiers learned a hard lesson: on the battlefield there are no luxuries. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we'll tell you everything about what the Soviet troops ate in World War II. But before we start, we'd like to thank Factor 75 for sponsoring this video. The best option to receive fresh food at home. Far from what the Soviets ate, today we can eat exquisite dishes, even without having to cook them ourselves. Because Factor 75 offers the best options to solve your kitchen problems, no more unhealthy fast food. Factor chefs prepare more than 27 dishes and 34 different additional options, completely fresh for you. You can choose your dishes or let them do it for you, based on your tastes and your order history. Then they deliver it to your door and take care of everything. The Soviets would die to try it and you can't miss it. Use my link or go to go.factor75.com and use the code FACTORS36999 for 50% off your first box. Now let's continue with today's video. Are you ready? Let's get started. In June 1941, the Third Reich launched Operation Barbarossa and began its invasion of the Soviet Union. Despite the fact that the Germans would end up regretting this campaign, the truth is that, in its beginnings, it was successful. The Red Army could not properly defend the Eastern Front, on the one hand, because it was too large a territory, and on the other because the Soviet military performance was extremely poor. The Nazis had superior weapons and tactics, and very soon the most important agricultural regions of Russia were in the hands of the Germans. In this way, the Soviet troops were deprived of their main source of food. Until the beginning of 1943, the communist forces fought under hardship conditions, eating the first thing they could find. A Russian soldier received a lean daily ration, consisting of a loaf of bread, canned lard spread, and vegetables left over from previous meals. One of the toughest moments of the war was the Battle of Stalingrad, between August 1942 and February 1943, when the Soviets had to defend the city from the Wehrmacht. On that occasion, the Red Army had to supply itself locally, that is, looting even the houses of its own compatriots, since they lacked the most basic provisions. In addition, they almost never managed to capture any food stores from the Germans, who in turn also suffered from serious supply problems. Since 1943, the countries of the Allied side began to help the Soviet Union through loans of money and resources, so that the communist forces could face the Germans on equal terms. The typical ration of a Russian soldier consisted of a piece of black bread, wheat flour, macaroni, meat, fish, and oatmeal. This was supplemented with sugar, tea, salt, and vegetables such as carrots, potatoes, beets, and cabbage. Tobacco was also regulated, as a man received 20 grams a day, and 3 boxes of matches a month. For women destined for the battlefield, the ration included butter, biscuits, and chocolate. The pilots received some extra items, such as fresh milk, cottage cheese, eggs and nuts. Submarine personnel were given sauerkraut, salted cucumbers, raw onions, and red wine. The purpose of these foods was to prevent scurvy and compensate for the lack of oxygen inside the submarines. It is interesting to note that the rations for the infantrymen did not include water, which they had to fetch at their own expense. This led many to turn to alcoholic beverages such as vodka. On the other hand, because pork was of great importance in rations, Jewish and Muslim Red Army soldiers complained to the officers, since their religion did not allow them to eat this food. However, nothing was done by the High Command to change this, and these troops had no choice but to accept this food or starve. A good part of the supplies consumed by Soviet soldiers was sent by England, which in turn bought them from Brazil and Argentina. These foods were canned and included meats, soups, concentrated broths, and pork jerky. Curiously, the Red Army officers forgot to relabel these products, which were distributed directly to the troops. The vast majority of the men could not read the labels written in English, creating serious logistical confusion. Nobody knew what the cans that were distributed contained, although this error was quickly corrected by applying small paper labels with an inscription in Russian indicating what was inside. One of the most popular foods on the Eastern Front was Spam, a canned food of North American origin. It was made with chopped pork, ham, salt, water, potatoes, and sodium nitrate. The United States government sent large quantities to the Soviet Union to prevent famines in the military and among the civilian population. Its importance was so great that Nikita Khrushchev, the future Soviet leader, wrote the following in his memoirs: "Without Spam, we would have been unable to feed our men." When everything else was scarce, the Red Army troops received this as their only food, 3 times a day, 7 days a week. For his part, Stalin was displeased to see that his forces were massively consuming a meal made in the great capitalist power of the United States, so he ordered to change the name of Spam to Tashanka, so that at least it would have a Russian sound. As for the supply, the Soviets developed a dynamic system for the moments in which their armies were in the middle of a combat. The soldiers' meals were prepared in field kitchens located behind the battle lines. These kinds of kitchens were typical of 19th century Russia, and were placed in the back of a truck or on a wheeled trailer. Each one had up to 4 cauldrons where the food was cooked, a compartment to store the food and the utensils with which to prepare everything. They ran on wood, so there were strict orders to cook early, before sunrise, or at night, just after sunset. With this, it was sought to prevent any enemy from detecting the smoke in the distance, and attacking the camp by surprise. Those in charge of preparing the dishes were generally women, and it was estimated that a simple one-course meal took an hour and a half. One of the specialties of the field kitchens were soups, which were easy to make and cheap. The most common were kalesh, which was made from millet and lard, borscht, which was made from beetroot, and shkai, cabbage soup. Once the dish was ready, the odyssey of delivering it to the soldiers who were immersed in combat began. One man had to carry the heavy cauldron of food from the field kitchen to the trench over uneven terrain, crowded with soldiers huddled together, bullets whizzing around them and shells exploding nearby. If he managed to survive and overcome all these obstacles, then he would deliver dinner to his unit mates, who would congratulate him on the feat, and together they would enjoy a warm meal. In short, the experience of the Soviet troops became, at times, a real nightmare, and it was only thanks to willpower that they managed to stay on their feet despite the severe food restrictions. We have reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, would you like to try the food of a Soviet soldier? World War II is one of the most important and studied military events in history. There are thousands of investigations about the heroic deeds that were carried out, but also about the brutal genocidal mechanisms that marked one of the darkest periods of humanity. There are even relevant data that are not usually mentioned, overshadowed by the stories of large operations. One of them is everything related to what the soldiers ate on the different battlefronts throughout Europe. Therefore, in this new episode of Military History, we are going to review what the rations of the different armies were like, and how the soldiers faced famine when their own food ran out. In war, food was always one of the most important things to consider. 2,500 years ago, in The Art of War, the Chinese strategist Sun Tzu recommended stealing supplies from enemies. According to the philosopher, a single ration of stolen food was worth 20 rations of your own, since it not only fed your troops, but also lowered the enemy's morale. Managing rations has never ceased to be a problem in the military, and World War II is proof of this. Perhaps the most brutal example of this was the siege of Stalingrad, when the German 7th Army, unable to receive resources, had to resort to other ways of feeding itself. At that time, Wehrmacht troops could be seen roaming the destroyed Soviet streets in search of cats to eat, after they had consumed the meat of their own horses. The experience was so traumatic that, by the end of this battle, the Germans were throwing themselves against the bullets of the Soviets, seeking an end to their famine. But, under a more controlled scenario, how were the food rations of the armies composed? The interesting thing about World War II, in this sense, is that it was the first conflict in which hermetically sealed rations were used, such as the well-known North American K-ration. Until this point, with a few minor exceptions during World War I, armies brought field cooks to the battlefield, who were responsible for preparing food for the battalions. It was in the interwar period that food preservation technology took a huge leap and allowed soldiers to load supplies into their gear. The K-ration was revolutionary in its time, and it ended up shaping the way all the world's armies feed their soldiers during campaigns. Its origins date back to 1941. The American physiologist Ansel Keys, who specialized in the creation of diets, began to study the psychological effects of food and food deprivation on people, and later published his thoughts. It was then that the U.S. military called on the doctor to create a new type of individual, non-perishable, ready-to-eat ration that could be easily carried in soldiers' pockets during short-term combat operations. Keys did something very strange. Instead of staying in the lab, he decided to search the local markets for food that was cheap but provided the energy needed to maintain a soldier's physique in the stressful conditions of combat. Finally, he composed a portion of 870 grams, which provided about 3,200 calories. It was made up of crackers, pork sausages, vegetable compote, candy and chocolate. Then he tried the diet for a while with 6 soldiers. The men complained that it wasn't tasty at all, but Keys found that the combination provided enough calories to keep them fit. The taste problem, of course, was closely related to his experimenting on well-fed soldiers on a U.S. base. When K-rations first made their way to airborne troops stationed in Europe, they were hailed as a gourmet wonder. What had they been eating up to that point? Mainly vegetable soups, potatoes, bread, casserole meals whose main component was rice. Before the K-ration, field cooks would throw whatever they had on hand into the pot. The scarcity of resources meant that nothing could be wasted, so the ingredients were not always in the best condition, or completely clean. The definitive version of the K-ration was implemented from 1942, and was composed of 3 portions. Breakfast included canned ham, chopped eggs, and meatloaf, plus biscuits, instant coffee, water cleansing tablets, and a trail mix. Lunch brought portions of meat and cheese, crackers, 15 condensed milk tablets that would later be replaced by candies, and powdered fruit juices. At dinner, the main course was preserved pork rump stew, chicken pâté, or pork sausage. Soup cubes, cookies and a chocolate bar were also added. Starting in 1943, 8 cigarettes a day were added to this healthy ration. It is important to note that, to this day, military rations are composed in this way. Except for cigarettes, of course, which are now optional. Also, as a curiosity, it is important to point out that, during important missions such as the Normandy landings, the Allied commanders gave their troops an excellent ration, consisting of steaks, salads, and ice cream for dessert. This was because many of them would never taste another meal again. But the truth is that the K-ration far exceeded the food of the German army. Apart from the field kitchens, or DlED, the Wehrmacht's transportable rations left a lot to be desired. There were 2 types, one for shorter operations, and one for longer trips. The first was called Alarmverpflegung, or emergency food. As its name implies, this handy ration was not intended to fully feed the soldiers, but was more of a snack. Literally, the idea was that the troops would get the necessary strength to stand on their 2 legs, and nothing more. Once received, soldiers had to consume it within 4 days, making it useful for short trips. It was made up of 700 grams of bread, 200 grams of cold meats, as well as hard biscuits, coffee, sugar, and 6 cigarettes. A breakfast of champions. Ideally, these rations were supposed to see the Germans between one meal in the war kitchens and another. But as the war progressed, the culinary strategy also had to change. When blitzkrieg ceased to be Hitler's main tactic, short attacks ceased to work and campaigns became longer. And longer voyages required longer-lasting rations. This is how the rival of the K-ration appeared, known as the Eisern portion or iron ration. This set of preserves and bread could be carried in the backpacks of Wehrmacht soldiers and, like the North American version, consisted of 3 portions. Breakfast was very meager, represented by coffee, biscuits, and some cheese. Lunch made up half the caloric value of the entire ration, and included meat, vegetables, and bread. Dinner consisted of biscuits, some meat, and coffee. The Eisern portion weighed about 600 grams, and did not meet the needs of the German soldiers who, on many occasions, consumed 2 or 3 of these rations per day, which complicated the administration of supplies. Although poor nutrition is not linked to the defeat of Germany during World War II, there are those who claim that food, as well as the lack of it, was essential for the Wehrmacht to weaken, especially during the campaigns in the Soviet Union. Thank you very much for joining us until the end. Stay tuned for our next video.